Hello and welcome to the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. My name is Aidan Muir and I'm here with my co-host Torwin Eerkens, and this is episode 221 where we are going to be talking about magnesium. And for this episode, which is really our first proper episode together, we wanted to do something that's broadly relevant to a lot of people. And I would say that magnesium fits into this because it's involved in so many processes in the body. There is this cliche that's involved in around 300 processes in the body that is often repeated. And it is true, it's involved in so much. And we're going to be covering a bunch of different areas that it's relevant for. And the other reason why it's relevant for so many people is because a massive percentage of people have a suboptimal intake of it as well. So throughout this podcast, we're going to be covering a bit about those specific different topics that it's relevant for. We're going to talk about food versus supplements, and then we're also going to be talking about deficiency versus suboptimal intake.
Absolutely. And having a deficiency as seen on a blood test with magnesium is actually quite rare because it only shows about 1% of your serum levels, and your body also regulates this very closely. So it's uncommon for us to see magnesium deficiencies as reflected on a blood test, but we know that measuring the intracellular levels of magnesium is actually quite difficult.
Yeah, particularly in Australia. As far as I know, it's not even really possible in Australia, or at least it's extremely difficult. So kind of rules that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Having that suboptimal intake then is, like you said, very common. We know that the RDI is 400 to 420 milligrams a day for men and then 310 to 320 milligrams a day for women. Now, we can get this from food sources through things like pumpkin seeds, chia seeds, sunflower seeds, poppy seeds, tofu, almonds, grainy bread, things like that. And I know you've got a bit more of an in-depth post on that as well. But in terms of getting it through food, what are your thoughts on food versus supplements?
So starting with food for a second, I think it's one of those ones just like other options like fiber and potassium and a few other ones where it's less about like individual foods and more just about having a decent amount of overall volume of magnesium-rich foods. So the reason why I use fiber as an example is say we're aiming for, let's say, 30 plus grams of fiber. There's no individual food that just has like 30 grams. Whereas say you are talking about vitamin C, you could just have an orange and you've met 100% of the RDI. I view magnesium that way. But then going to supplements, it's an interesting one because I typically have a view that I consider supplements as a solid option when somebody is unlikely to be reaching their targets through food. And when you view it through that perspective, if the majority of people aren't reaching it through food, supplementation could be a good option for the majority of people, although we also have the option of increasing it through food too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we are considering those acute effects of magnesium that we're about to discuss, potentially supplementing is an option. And I think specifically if we're looking at dosing at certain times of the day and for specific reasons. So I think that's what we'll kind of go through today as well.
Yeah, the biggest one, let's start with that. I would say is sleep, where I would say the timing is more likely to be relevant if this does matter. So if we're looking beyond just reaching targets and we're looking at specific timings, I would say sleep is where it's relevant. So we've spoken about sleep a bit on this podcast in terms of Leah and I have spoken about it. And I view it as an area where we don't have a lot of definitive research in regular healthy people. We just have clues. So one of the clues is that higher magnesium intake through food is linked to better sleep. Another is that research looking at magnesium and insomnia is very positive. Like the research, I'm not saying we have heaps of it, but the research that we do have looks like it helps quite a bit. And anecdotally, a lot of people with just things like Apple Watches and stuff like that where they measure their sleep often see improvements, although we obviously have the issue of placebo control lacking there. But there are a lot of gaps in the research, but there are some clues that I see no downside of it and potential upside.
Absolutely. And what about in practice? Because what I see often is, like you said, that anecdotal people who report that they do sleep better, they sleep deeper, they fall asleep faster. And I think that alone sometimes has a fair bit of value as well.
Yeah. And the way I do this in practice is if somebody just wants to take a magnesium supplement by itself, I'm all for it. If somebody wants my recommendation, my actual recommendation is probably a multi-ingredient sleep supplement that has a few other ingredients that probably have a similar level of evidence for sleep in the average person. And that way, if we get, say, 5 different ingredients that all have no downside and may or may not have some upside, you combine that with then also having a bit of placebo of taking something that you know that helps you sleep, having a bit of a routine because you probably have to do this like 30 to 60 minutes before you go to sleep. And it's quite likely to improve their sleep, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. And if we're looking at the research on supplements specifically, we know that there isn't that research to solidify that this is the best one, this amount, this often or at this time. But generally the recommendation that we do say is magnesium glycinate is the one that we would recommend for this. Typically that 200 to 400 milligrams, 30 to 60 minutes before sleep.
For sure. Yeah, that makes sense as well. So the next one we'll do bone health.
Yeah, let's chat about it.
Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so we know that magnesium is a component of bone and about 60% of your body's magnesium is stored there. So what it does is it does help the formation and density of your bone through helping with the building cells, regulating your parathyroid hormone, but also the vitamin D concentrations that can help with maintaining this bone homeostasis. So then if we have a look at research, higher dietary magnesium is definitely linked with greater bone mineral density. And then we could also look at the opposite and agree with it in the sense that lower intake is also associated with the lower bone mineral density, but also higher fracture risk.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good summary. And something that I find interesting on top of that is if you looked at research just on supplementing magnesium with a large population group of people above a certain age, we typically do see increases in bone mineral density. It's one where I've got an interesting stance. I can't really tell you why I've got this stance, but for some reason, bone health isn't an area where I lean towards supplements. I would, in almost all cases, go food first there. But there's no reason that I can defend that stance beyond the fact that I think a lot of people have room for improvement with their dietary intake, and also that if they did that, it probably increases intake of other things that are likely to help with bone health, whether that is potassium or calcium or a few other things too.
Yeah, and I think even exploring it in the sense that some populations may be more at risk of that related osteoporosis, so maybe menopausal women, that's where I've seen a bit of research, looking at in those populations, making sure that you are addressing dietary intake first.
Yeah. The next big one is cramps, and this one obviously comes up a lot. Magnesium clearly plays a theoretical role in cramping. You could very clearly see that if you tested people who were magnesium deficient, as measured by that just standard blood test, you would see a lot more cramping most likely. But the bigger question is whether this is practical. For example, are the majority of athletes who cramp, are they deficient? Like as we've spoken about, deficiency is quite rare. Does suboptimal intake, stuff like that, matter as well?
Yeah, so a review that I looked at specifically cramp frequency in skeletal muscles, and it was based on 11 trials with magnesium supplementation specifically for cramps. And interestingly, it didn't significantly reduce cramp frequency or intensity, but also they didn't report much significant value with supplementing that magnesium. On the other hand of things, though, people did report a fair bit of gastrointestinal upset, so things like diarrhea, with about 11 to 37% of people involved in those trials reporting that, which can be pretty negative.
Yeah, back in the day, believe it or not, I used to be open to brand deals. Didn't do many of them, but a supplement company added magnesium to their gels, like quite high dose, like 400 milligrams, I think. And they just wanted to get me to do some videos promoting their gels in general, and one of those was those gels. And I spent ages trying to find research to support this. And I was like, does it help with cramps? Does it help? And it is really disappointing when you look at the research on athletes specifically that it just doesn't seem to move the needle. Anecdotally, heaps of people report that though.
And again, I think if we look at that again, is it worth doing? Yes, if there's no side effects and they're not getting that gastrointestinal upset, maybe it is.
Yeah, and I would say probably potentially a lower dosage and also form. We'll talk about forms later as well. Another thing that, because we have spoken about cramps on the podcast before, is I think anecdotally looking at cramps in athletes specifically will almost always be misleading because we have this whole neuromuscular fatigue concept, which is hypothetically if you did the same training 4 weeks in a row, the likelihood of cramping in week 1 is so much higher than it is in week 4. So say week 1 you cramp, week 2 you cramp, week 3 you add a supplement and you don't cramp. There are high odds you could have just kept doing what you were doing and you wouldn't have cramped regardless.
Yep, so it's hard to see, hard to know.
Mental health. So we'll talk about mental health, and I find this one a tricky one to communicate. So recent reviews looking at this at the broad range of research have consistently been finding that magnesium supplementation helps with depression and anxiety. The reason I find this tricky to communicate is because it's still only one variable, and an improvement on average could still just be a small improvement on average. And I don't want to overhype anything. This is also how I talk about other areas of nutrition, such as vitamin D. I've seen, it's rare, but I've seen some people try to criticize whether vitamin D matters or not. And I don't want to say cherry pick, but they can find stuff where it doesn't like solve massive problems. And I look at it thinking, did you really think it would. Like, did you really think vitamin D in isolation is going to massively move the needle on, say, depression, for example, where there's so many things involved? And if you do the same thing with magnesium, where it's like, it's incredible for us to see that this does seem to help on average, I don't want to overhype it.
I agree with you there. I think doing it in isolation, exactly that part what you just said, is often not going to make everything better or be that complete picture. Especially when you said just before, so there is evidence that it helps with some disorders, but on the other side of things like, ADHD, OCD, schizophrenia, that sort of thing, we haven't seen that evidence there. So again, maybe it isn't the complete answer.
Yeah, for sure. There's this saying of like, when you're holding a hammer, everything you see is a nail. I see that a lot in nutrition with like basically every topic. But even just within nutrition, you can hyper-focus on certain areas. Like if you looked at gut health and mental health, you would find a huge link there. If you looked at nutrients individually, like magnesium, vitamin D, and so on and so forth, you would see a huge link there. And that's just one component out of everything.
Let's chat about gut-related stuff then. So
your area especially, we've written some notes for ourselves. We don't see each other's notes. We're trying something new with that, but I've got like one sentence on constipation related stuff and being like, magnesium citrate has pretty solid evidence for helping with constipation. Because this is your area, we'll talk about this a bit more. I think we've spoken off air that neither of us actually use it specifically with clients, but it is an option. Do you use it at all?
I use it as a secondary option, and we'll chat about how it works. So it is an osmotic laxative, specifically magnesium citrate, which is the one that I would recommend in this situation. And it does work by drawing water into the bowels, easing stool passage, softening it so you can pass stool. If I've had clients who have tried other osmotic laxative and it hasn't worked so well, this is always one that I'm like, okay, potentially we look at using it. Again, just noting that for some people it can lead to potentially diarrhea and not so fantastic gastrointestinal symptoms. So using it like with a bit of reservation.
I've seen some clients having 400 milligrams per day just as a regular magnesium supplement who have also had diarrhea just in general. And I'm like, this is the first thing we'll take out. This is surely the first thing we take out.
Absolutely. Because if I'm looking at someone with chronic constipation, I'm recommending 300, maybe 400 milligrams. But that is someone who doesn't have, who's struggling to move their bowels. So having someone who then has extreme diarrhea definitely would address and remove that there.
Yeah. So now I want to talk about magnesium and muscle recovery. And this is something I've been looking at for a while. So there are some proposed mechanisms. One of the main one is that magnesium acts as a natural muscle relaxant. This is also why it's proposed to help with cramps as well. And it also helps play a role in muscle protein synthesis and in inflammation. We also have pretty clear research showing that magnesium levels drop during exercise as well. It's hard to say how much that matters, but they clearly do drop during exercise. And you could potentially make an argument for offsetting that with supplementation as well. But the biggest and most obvious question is, what does the research show on the topic? Because we have these theoretical reasons, but as we were talking about with cramps earlier, does that actually always translate? So if we're looking specifically at delayed onset muscle soreness, which is what I want to use as the measurement of recovery here, there was a systematic review in 2024 which found 4 studies, so not heaps of studies, but it did find 4 studies. And they did find that magnesium supplementation reduced muscle soreness. So that's interesting. That's good to know. They also found, using the author's wording, that it improved performance, recovery in general, and had a protective effect on muscle damage. They used various forms and timings and dosages of magnesium, but they were all between 300 and 500 milligrams of magnesium. And it was a pretty broad one, but to summarize, the authors concluded that to achieve these positive effects, what they recommended to individuals who engage in intense exercise is they should have 10 to 20% more magnesium than sedentary people. I didn't read this in this review, but the logic behind that is partly related to losses during exercise, for example, through sweating. And they also said if supplementing, take it around 2 hours before training, which is partly based on the logic of how long it takes to peak in the blood and also in relation to that drop during training too.
And that was something that I wanted to touch on, and if what you do with your clients in practice, because yes, we can use it for sleep. Maybe we dose before bedtime. If we use it for training, is that something that you commonly do?
It's something I have thoughts on, but I haven't been doing with people. So I'm far more open to doing it before sleep with people. I have had a lot of people who've spoken about taking magnesium for recovery. In terms of what I've anecdotally seen with people doing without my input, I haven't seen anybody taking it before training for this reason, but it probably honestly wasn't only until like within the last few years that I came across this concept of magnesium levels dropping during training. And it's left me more with the question of, does this matter? And obviously using a review like this, it does seem to help with delayed onset muscle soreness, but that still leads a lot more questions out there as well in terms of how much does that matter? Like at the baseline, it's like, well, I'd rather not be sore. Like if I have a choice, I'd rather not be sore. But how much of a difference is the soreness? I also think if you train hard, you're bound to be sore at some stage anyway. Like we have research showing that fish oil reduces soreness. We talk about tart cherry juice and all of these other things, but I'm not necessarily using tart cherry juice as an example. I'm not recommending that to everybody because some of this stuff really adds up, both in terms of cost, but then also the fact that you can be taking 10 plus different supplements when my current stance is for the muscle recovery stuff. I'd prefer people to just get through food, albeit I understand that that's flawed with the timing and stuff here too.
Yeah, and even important to consider that, maybe supplementation in general, we're then also looking at things like, is it helping with sleep down the line? Are you then just recovering better because you're having better sleep? That sort of thing.
And then do you end up doubling up and have it, like, because if you care enough about it from the recovery standpoint here and before training, you probably also care enough about it from the sleep perspective. And then how much do you end up having? I don't know. There's a lot of questions I have there.
Absolutely.
Have we got anything else to cover? Any other topics? If we don't, we'll talk about specific types of supplements now. So we've touched on magnesium citrate. I think both of us would, if we were to use it, we would only use it for constipation and we wouldn't use it for anything else. Even just the risk of it causing diarrhea in other people is why we would avoid it. The other one I would probably go with is magnesium glycinate for most other things. There's benefits people talk about in relation to like the blood-brain barrier and stuff like that. I just think it's a bit of a safe bet in terms of it's one that's consistently shown with helping all of these things without any detriment, like it doesn't cause any GI symptoms or anything like that. And when you read these studies, like often they don't even mention the form of magnesium that it is, but it seems to be one of the safest bets for me.
Yeah, and I'm the same. That's the one that I would recommend majority of the time. So this has been episode 221 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast, where we have discussed magnesium. Now, if you've resonated with anything that we have said today, maybe it is worth having a look into your magnesium intake or considering supplementation.
And once again, I'd absolutely love it if anybody can please leave a rating or review. We're obviously pushing this hard for this phase with this kind of new relaunch of the podcast. But if you do, it would absolutely mean the world to both myself and Torwin.